No, that doesn't work very well. So apparently things turn around depending on which system you're running with. Anyway, so we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of OSG this year, and if this was that way, what you see here is the ribbon cutting on July 20th, 2005. And you can probably recognize at least one of these people, Kevin, is Kevin online? Yeah. Kevin, he's been a program manager in various incarnations of various projects ever since. And I just to show that some things don't change. So I did make sure to wear a black and white T-shirt. I even have the shorts with me, but it was too cold in this room, so I stuck to long pants. And so I wanted to. Okay, same problem. I wanted to. So I Googled what do we have online as information from way back then. And I found a presentation by Doug Olson from 2005, September. And in that presentation, there were a number of different slides that I found sort of amusing and interesting. There was a number of jobs per day, which this year is about 500. So which kind of is 500 jobs run in a day back in 2005. And then there was an even funnier one. There was a total amount of data moved, but it didn't say what time interval of 100 gigabytes moved. And then there was a map, and I then counted how many institutions are on that map. It's 26. And so OSG started with 26 institutions in 2005. And then I asked myself, physicists one and lots of zeros kind of logic. What's happened? What's the growth in 20 years? We grew the number of institutions roughly 10 times. The data movement, as you'll see later, roughly 1 million times. Went from 100 gig to 100 petabytes. And number of jobs per day, roughly 1,000 times is the kind of scale that we've seen in the last 20 years. Then I asked myself, OSG is a distributed infrastructure. How do institutions join now versus in 2005? What's changed? And so that then got me into this rabbit hole. And so we have compute and data. Data as a structural entity barely existed in 2005. I mean, in fact, 1 million is basically means it didn't exist in 2005. So I leave that for Brian to talk more about. We have origins and caches now. So data is the details you'll hear about from Brian. For compute, there's actually a very broad set of things that have changed. And so, well, there's of course the OS pool that didn't exist at all in 2005. And then more than a dozen private pools. There's the notion in 2005, we had a single Condor pool for everybody. Everybody had to fit into this somehow. At this point in time, communities get to pick. Either you play within the public pool, the OS pool, or you instantiate your own. And when you instantiate your own, you have a choice. Which parts do you run and which parts do you have us run? And these dozen private pools that we are involved in running, they range from about 1,000 to a few 100,000 cores per pool. So a very wide dynamic range in sizes. And then where things really get diverse, so to speak, is how do you fill your pool? There's a variety of different ways to fill the pool that you then allocate and have stuff running in. And there is the client S submits via hosted CEs, RPM installed CEs. There are client in container managed by side, user submitted client in. There's now Kubernetes provisioner that doesn't involve that submits the clients themselves. And I've probably forgotten some. So there's sort of a mini explosion of mechanisms to choose from on how do you want to bring your resources to your or the public pool in order to run. And then I went from there into, so who joins and how can you join? How, if you have resources, how do you integrate those resources? And I'd say that there is a very significant change that's happened fairly recently. An institution can join at different layers of the stack. You can join a pool via provisioning mechanism. In other words, you can pick any of these and then fill the pool. However, you can also join at the NRP at the Kubernetes infrastructure, or you can have your hardware run all the way from IPMI up. And that then literally means that you join the OS pool, but you join via NRP as a site. So behind that one site, there is 50 locations or 70 locations behind it that all joined via either joining Kubernetes or via all the way from the hardware. So institutions differ in the effort they have to join and could control desire after joining. If you have minimal effort and want minimal control, you go the IPMI route. If you have maximal effort or sizable effort and want lots of control, then you join pools via hosted CE and cloud WMS. So people were given now choices. That wasn't the case in 2005. And then that led me into the rabbit hole of what does it mean, effort? What's involved in actually joining? What's on your side? And what are your choices of control? And what effort does it mean? And I won't belabor this, but there's sort of the obvious. This is the list that I came up with as the kind of effort that's required if you wanted to have full control. Maximum control means you need to do all of these things. And if you're willing to give up control, well, you can outsource lots of this, most of this, in fact, if you do so desire. Which brings me then, who is in today? Where are the sites in OSG? And that gets me to the custom version of the map, which has 207 institutions. And Miron already said that, why does mine have only 168? 161, something like that. So the difference, Miron, is that I had Canon make me a special map in order to not have Kevin Thompson complain about the map. Because in previous times when we've showed the map, Kevin complained, but what about all those sites, all those locations that enter OSG via NRP? You don't show them on your map. And so now we show them on our map. So we have responded to Kevin, I think it was last year or the year before. So it sometimes takes us a little bit because it actually required us to go from the bottom from NRP to have a common naming of institutions. So NRP had to, OSG and Path sweat out what the name of an institution is, and then pick a mechanism, a process for how to decide whether the University of California, San Diego is called that way, or whether it's UC San Diego, UCSD, or any other permutation of naming something. And so OSG chose a framework to pick the name based on ROAR, and then NRP adopted that framework after some discussion, and then we had to move the identifier from the bottom to the top such that OSG at the top knew that the bottom used the same name as the top. And that then made it possible for Karen to put this all on a map. And so literally, this map was created Friday. So voila, that's why I have a different map than Miron. And nicely, we traversed the 200 because when Kevin asked us, why don't you put that on the map? I'm sure you'll exceed 200. Voila, Kevin, you were right. We exceed 200 once we put that on the map. I didn't have to pay anything, Derek did it. Derek was the intermediary. Anyway, so if you then, I wanted to make a brief comment about international institutions. There's always a question of how and when do we decide that we are actually allowed to work with somebody internationally. And we are implementing what we consider to be a National Science Foundation rule, that any US scientist may request that their international collaborators are integrated into OSG. So if somebody within the US has an international collaborator, then we will integrate their resources into OSG upon request. And so that's basically how all of these resources came about. The one exception we're making for historical reason, we do not count institutions that we engage with only because of the LHC. Given that the LHC has its own organization principle outside the US, we're not going to count whatever gets organized by that organizing principle. So if you look at all of these places outside the US, they are because LIGO wants them, because NOAA wants them, because OSCF wanted them, a variety of different organizations, or because Julio Ibarra wanted them, because I just see you, Julio, I think that's where these guys came from. And so there is a US individual organization that requests, and voila, off we go and integrate. Open Science Data Federation, 22 origins, 37 caches across 5 continents. It keeps on growing. And then the accounting for the year is about 150 petabyte of data access last year. If you then divide by the number of seconds that are in a year, it's roughly a 40 gigabit per second average over the year. So we keep roughly 40 gigabit per second across moving in aggregate all the time, 24/7, 365, or whatever the right saying is across the map. If you then look into the details of the usage, I'm obsessed with distinguishing unique data versus data accessed or read, and then figuring out the multiplication factor, meaning how often is it accessed, and then I'm going to sort of plotting this in 2-dimensional planes, and those are the different 2-dimensional planes. And the spreadsheet that Derek produced for me to make this work, then I looked inside, and they're sort of arbitrarily, I said, okay, fine. If somebody has read more than a petabyte, that's a lot. And so there's 26 top-level directories with more than a petabyte read, and 17 of these are OS pool users. They're basically individuals, and it is their space on some AP or something like that, which then there's LIGO, IceCube, NRP has 2, and so forth. And if you look the inverse way of doing this and say, how many have more than a terabyte of unique data read, you see 40 top-level directories with more than a terabyte of unique data. And it is predominantly lots of different kinds of scientific collaboration with much less of the OS pool users. So collaborations continue to have larger volumes of unique data. OS pool users access smaller volumes more often. And finally, there is an open science store, a new concept, and you can ask me about this later. It is basically the 20% contribution from the CC star has now finally found its way through the system, and we're actually using it. And I've listed here some of the allocations that we've given out. I want to say this is strictly prototyping stage. If you want to be part of the prototype users, send us an email. Now, last thing, with a minute left to spare, I wanted to, I sent these slides to Miron yesterday. He said, what about the future? And I scratched my head. Yeah, what about the future? And so I call it Dare We Predict the Future. And I think that probably the details is more or less a crapshoot, predicting the future. But I think that one thing I'm reasonably certain I'm reasonably certain that we'll see more change during the next 20 years than the last 20 years. And let me justify that for a second. The reason why I think that we will see more change in the next 20 years than the last 20 years is really fundamental technology. If you look at what's happening in the computer industry, then there is basically Moore's law is up, Dennard's law is up. That's stopped a few years ago. And now we sort of see this percolate through the entire value chain across all areas. If you think about science as output is a product of hardware times algorithm, then in order for science to advance, either hardware needs to become more powerful for free at fixed price, or algorithms have to become better. And in the past, we had more or less the same algorithms with little changes, and hardware became better exponentially because of Moore's law and Dennard's law. That's gone, finished. So right now, hardware makes improvements because architecture is changing. That's the difference between CPUs and GPUs. FPGAs are coming, ASICs, all kinds of things is happening. Now, hardware, and at the same time, algorithms is where the real explosion is happening in the last few years. Algorithms are changing dramatically. AI is the buzzword, but more generally, for science to make rapid improvements, advances at fixed budget or shrinking budget as our federal government, the product of the other two has to grow at fixed money. And if I had to bet, you're going to see more architectural change in the hardware, and you're going to see more architectural change in the algorithms. And the fact that these two things change dramatically going forwards will lead to more change in the next 20 years than we've seen in the last 20 years. Questions?
So your last slide is scary for particular reason that the real benefit that or the real enabler of distributed high throughput computing was to a certain degree homogeneity. Now, if that goes out of the door, what happens?
Say that again, Igor.
So being here, not exactly 40 years, but I have been around for more than 20. The big win of distributed high throughput computing, or the enabling factor of the high throughput computing, was to a large degree homogeneity. Now, you are predicting that's out of the door. No more homogeneity. Everything will fracture at an exponentially fast rate. What happens?
I think that homogeneity lies in the eyes of the beholder. Meaning what looks homogeneous at a certain layer of abstraction is actually highly heterogeneous at a different layer of abstraction. And it behooves to us to find the right layers of abstraction in order to create the kind of homogeneity that allow us to create scale and therefore make this all work. So while example, the number of different kinds of systems that we currently operate is incredibly heterogeneous. If you look at it by the amount of memory, the number of cores, the amount of memory per core, the amount of how applications need either memory or cores in some kind of mix and if you compare to what we started off in 2005, it is incredibly heterogeneous today. If you compare it to where we're heading, it is incredibly homogeneous. And so I think that it behooves us to figure out what it means to still be automatable. So automation was easy is easy when everything is all the same. It becomes harder when everything is not all the same. And it's the layer of abstraction at which we can think of it as the same and automate it despite its heterogeneity. And that is a research enterprise question. Does that?
All right. Thanks, Frank.